The air hung heavy and frigid, smelling of salt, new steel, and the pervasive, almost oily scent of the Thames River. Below the towering gantry cranes, where the sky was an unforgiving canvas of winter gray, a crowd of dignitaries and engineers huddled, their breath plumes hanging like ghosts in the raw morning. All eyes were fixed on the black, sleek hull that rested against the dock, the USS Nautilus, designated Season 571. This wasn't just another submarine. It was a promise, a threat, and the material embodiment of a quantum leap in naval warfare. For decades, the world's underwater fleets had been slaves to the internal combustion engine. Submariners lived a life of brutal compromise, a brief, tense dash underwater on electric battery power, followed by the agonizing necessity of snorting. Raising a diesel air intake above the waves, running the noisy, vibrating engines, and gulping down precious oxygen to recharge the batteries and refresh the stale, carbon dioxide-rich air within the hull. A diesel-electric submarine, like the best of the Soviets' current Project 611, the Zulu-class boats, could barely maintain 5 knots submerged for a few hours before the batteries ran down to dangerously low levels. Its operational doctrine was an endless cycle of rise, breathe, run, and hide. Submariners like Lieutenant Commander Eugene P. Dennis Wilkinson, the Nautilus's prospective commanding officer, knew this life intimately. He stood on the deck, a figure of quiet, coiled intensity, feeling the subtle, contained power thrumming beneath his feet. The core of the Nautilus's revolutionary nature lay not in its hull form, which was relatively conventional for the time, but in the shielded reactor compartment deep within. Inside, superheated water would generate steam, turning turbines that drove the single massive propeller. The power source was fission, a handful of refined uranium, sealed away. The implications were staggering. A submarine driven by an energy source that did not require oxygen. No snorting, no battery limitations. The simple physics of its design meant that the Nautilus could remain submerged for months, limited only by the endurance of its crew and the stocks of food, not by the mechanics of its propulsion. It could cross the entire Atlantic Ocean, from New London to Liverpool, without ever once breaking the surface. This day, January 17th, 1955, was the initial sea trials. A massive, ceremonial valve, painted fire engine red, was ready to be opened. As the final mooring lines were cast off, Commander Wilkinson transmitted a simple, momentous message via the ship's intercom. Underway on nuclear power. The phrase was simple, yet it signaled the instantaneous obsolescence of every other submarine in the world. The shift was absolute. The diesel world died with those 4 words. 2 days later, the Soviet naval attaché stationed in Washington, D.C., Captain First Rank Ilya Volkov, received a heavily censored and subtly alarmist report. The key intelligence was a fragment, a U.S. Navy report that stated the Nautilus achieved a submerged speed in excess of 20 knots and sustained this speed for extended periods. Volkov stared at the number 20. For a Soviet Zulu-class boat, submerged speed was a brief, maximum effort 16 knots, dropping quickly as batteries drained. Sustained 20 knots was not just a performance increase. It was a fundamental, strategic breakthrough. His first thought was of the physics. 20 knots submerged, sustained, demanded an energy source that didn't consume air. He immediately dictated a classified signal to the Soviet naval staff in Moscow, requesting urgent clarification and technical analysis. The Kremlin's quiet disbelief was about to turn into full-blown panic. The Americans had opened a silent, secret front in the Cold War, and the Soviet Union was already years behind. In Moscow, the report from Captain Volkov landed on the desk of Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Navy. Gorshkov was a man of steel and ambition, but even he felt a cold knot of dread reading the terse, coded analysis of the Nautilus's performance. The Americans hadn't just built a better submarine. They had invalidated the entire Soviet submarine doctrine overnight. Soviet naval strategy was built around the massive fleet of diesel-electric boats, the Whiskey, Zulu, and forthcoming Foxtrot classes, designed for coastal defense and harassing Western convoys. These boats were now technologically prehistoric. A single, submerged Nautilus could transit the breadth of the North Atlantic undetected, position itself off Murmansk or Vladivostok, launch a simulated attack, and disappear, all while the Soviet diesel patrol boats desperately struggled to keep up, forced to surface to recharge and breathe. Gorshkov immediately called an emergency, highly classified meeting in the Kremlin's naval section. Present were the leading nuclear physicists and naval engineers, chief among them Anatoly Alexandrov, the brilliant but overworked scientific head of the burgeoning Soviet nuclear program, and the submarine designer Vladimir Peregidov. The atmosphere in the meeting room was thick with professional anxiety. The challenge was laid bare. The Americans had cracked the code of shipboard nuclear propulsion. Alexandrov, his face etched with fatigue from years spent developing the Soviet hydrogen bomb, confirmed the impossibility of the American feat without a reactor. "Comrades," he stated, his voice low but cutting through the tension, "a submerged speed of 20 knots is simply not sustainable with any battery technology we currently possess or, frankly, that could be conceivably developed. It requires continuous, immense power generation. The reports are technically consistent with only one source, a pressurized water reactor." The difficulty for the Soviets wasn't just building a reactor. It was building one small enough, light enough, and safe enough to fit inside a submarine hull. The power density had to be enormous. Peregidov, the submarine designer, grimaced. "Our current reactor designs are too large, too heavy, and frankly, too unstable for a mobile platform. The shielding requirements alone are monstrous." He pointed out the core dilemma. A submarine's primary advantage is silence. A massive, complex, steam-driven reactor plant was inherently noisy, prone to vibration, and required heavy, complex pumps and machinery, all potential acoustical signatures that could turn the boat into a sonar target. The Soviet nuclear submarine program, Project 627, later dubbed the November class by NATO, was already underway, but it was proceeding slowly, hampered by bureaucracy and a lack of unified technical focus. The urgency was now terrifyingly real. Stalin, who had died 2 years prior, had authorized the project, but the momentum was lacking. Now, the new leadership under Khrushchev demanded results, and they demanded them yesterday. Admiral Gorshkov gave his famous, chilling directive: "We must match the Americans. We must surpass them. Their boat is an SSN, a submarine hunter. Ours must be a response. It will carry a strategic weapon. We will build a weapon of retaliation that can hide in the depths and threaten their coastlines. We need a nuclear reactor now. The reactor is not a complication, Comrade Alexandrov. It is the weapon itself." The immediate consequence was a massive, secretive diversion of resources. Scientists and engineers were pulled from other strategic projects. The demand for enriched uranium, the reactor's fuel, skyrocketed, placing immediate, crushing strain on the Soviet atomic infrastructure. The entire shipbuilding complex at Severodvinsk was reorganized and placed under direct military control, transforming a shipyard into a heavily guarded nuclear manufacturing facility. The mandate was brutal. The Nautilus was sailing in 1955. The Soviet answer, the K-3 Leninsky Komsomol, the first Project 627 boat, had to be at sea by 1958. 3 years to compress a decade of technological development. The race wasn't just about naval dominance. It was about the very credibility of the Soviet Union as a technological superpower capable of competing with the West. The silent hunt had begun, and the Soviets were playing catch-up in the cold, dark waters. While Moscow wrestled with the daunting reality of Project 627, the Americans had already moved far beyond the initial sea trials of the Nautilus. The true, unheralded engine behind the entire U.S. nuclear program was a controversial, demanding, and utterly relentless figure, Admiral Hyman G. Rickover. Nicknamed the father of the nuclear navy, Rickover operated with a singular, often brutal, focus, viewing technical excellence not as an option, but as a matter of national survival. He possessed complete, almost autocratic control over the design, engineering, construction, and crew training for every nuclear ship. He understood that a nuclear reactor, especially one crammed into a submarine hull, was inherently dangerous, demanding a level of quality control and professional rigor unprecedented in naval history. Rickover's fundamental genius was not just in designing the S-2W reactor that powered the Nautilus, but in creating the administrative and engineering infrastructure to replicate it safely and reliably. He instituted a draconian system of inspections, qualification boards, and non-negotiable standards. Every single pump, valve, weld, and pipe joint was documented, inspected, and signed off on by multiple engineers. His philosophy was simple. There is no second chance with a nuclear core. A leak, a meltdown, or a catastrophic failure deep underwater was unacceptable not only for the crew, but for the entire credibility of the American nuclear enterprise. This obsessive focus translated directly into the Nautilus's performance. The Soviets were correct in their analysis. A reactor plant is naturally noisy. The massive turbines, the cooling pumps, the reduction gears, all of them generate noise or radiated signature, which sonar operators, both Soviet and NATO, are trained to detect. However, the American effort had been focused from the start on acoustic stealth. Rickover's teams mandated the use of shock mounts for all machinery, painstakingly balanced every turbine blade, and used advanced sound-dampening materials throughout the propulsion system. This was the key operational advantage the Soviets initially missed. The Nautilus was not just fast and long-legged, it was quiet. A diesel submarine going 10 knots underwater created a cacophony of engine and propeller noise easily detectable at range. The Nautilus, traveling at 20 knots, was often quieter than a diesel boat at 5 knots. This silence, combined with its endurance, gave the submarine the terrifying ability to simply vanish into the vastness of the ocean, a true silent service weapon. The crews under Rickover were also molded into a new breed of naval professional. The admiral personally interviewed every prospective officer, grilling them on physics, engineering, and personal integrity. The nuclear navy wasn't about seamanship. It was about systems management, chemistry, and thermodynamics. Lieutenant Commander Wilkinson and his successors commanded sailors who were essentially nuclear engineers, entrusted with managing a volatile, immensely powerful source of energy only a few feet from their bunks. This level of professionalization was another significant structural hurdle the Soviet Navy would struggle to match, where political loyalty often still outweighed technical expertise in key positions. By 1958, while the Soviet K-3 was still struggling through construction issues in Severodvinsk, the Nautilus embarked on Operation Sunshine. This was the ultimate demonstration of the nuclear submarine's capability, a transit under the Arctic ice cap. This mission was not just a stunt. It was a profound strategic statement. The Arctic had long been considered an impenetrable barrier. By sailing beneath the pole from the Pacific to the Atlantic, the Nautilus proved that the globe was now entirely open to nuclear submarine transit. It meant that a nuclear missile-armed submarine could launch from any ocean and surface near any continental shelf undetected. The oceans were no longer barriers. They were launch platforms. This was the moment the scale of the American lead became truly undeniable, confirming the Soviet fear that the entire balance of naval power had shifted to the depths. August 3, 1958, 90 feet beneath the frozen roof of the Arctic Ocean. Inside the control room of the USS Nautilus, the atmosphere was a mix of intense focus and a simmering, nervous anticipation. Commander William R. Anderson, the new commanding officer, stood at the periscope well, though the periscopes were useless, staring only into impenetrable ice. Above them, the ice cap was a colossal, churning blanket of frozen seawater, miles thick in places. The sound of the ice moving and scraping against the hull was a deeply unnerving, guttural sound, one that no submariner had ever experienced for an extended duration. They were sailing through a dark, cold, and immensely hostile environment, navigating by sophisticated inertial navigation systems and advanced upward-looking sonar, technology far beyond the capabilities of the Soviet fleet. The transit was not without significant peril. The Arctic Ocean is filled with ice keels, massive, downward-projecting ridges of ice that could scrape the hull or even trap the boat. The crew had to constantly monitor the upward-looking sonar, watching the jagged, alien landscape of the ice-sealing pass only tens of feet above the sail. This was a challenge utterly impossible for a diesel boat, which would have rapidly depleted its oxygen and battery power while attempting to navigate such a complex, submerged maze. The Nautilus's nuclear power meant this wasn't a desperate dash. It was a calculated, sustained passage. At 2,315 hours, the Nautilus crossed the exact North Pole. Commander Anderson's historic, understated message to his crew announced, "For the world, our geographic position is 90 degrees north, 0 degrees east. For us, we are exactly where we intended to be." It was a moment of technical triumph and profound geopolitical consequence. The submarine had traveled 1,830 miles completely submerged, from the Bering Strait to the Greenland Sea. When the news was publicly released, the impact on global politics was seismic. It instantly proved the viability of the polar route for attack submarines and, more importantly, for the future fleet ballistic missile submarines, SSBNs. If the U.S. could transit the pole with an attack boat, they could do it with a missile boat, placing a layer of nuclear deterrence directly on the Soviet Union's northern doorstep, completely bypassing the heavily monitored Soviet defense lines in the Atlantic and Pacific. In Moscow, the intelligence reports detailing the Nautilus's Arctic feat were met with a fresh wave of alarm. Admiral Gorshkov understood immediately that the American technological lead was widening dangerously. The Soviet Project 627, the future K-3, was struggling with its complex, first-of-a-kind VMA reactor. The reactor's initial testing was plagued by instability and major shielding concerns. Soviet engineers, attempting to compress the timescale, were cutting corners, a decision that would have devastating future consequences. The contrast was stark. The Americans were perfecting advanced navigation and pushing operational boundaries with their proven reactor design. The Soviets were still battling fundamental engineering problems. The Nautilus's voyage forced the Kremlin to inject even greater, almost impossible urgency into the Project 627 schedule. The order from Khrushchev's Presidium was clear. The K-3 must be launched and operational. The Soviet Union could not be seen to concede the strategic depths to the United States. The Arctic transit changed the focus of the Soviet program from merely matching the Americans to a desperate race to establish a second strike capability before the U.S. gained total strategic depth supremacy. The pressure on the engineers at Severodvinsk Shipyard No. 402, later known as Sevmash, was immense, bordering on the impossible. The keel for the Soviet Union's first nuclear submarine, Project 627, NATO designation, November class, was laid in September 1955, months after the Nautilus was already at sea. The boat, designated K-3 and later named Leninsky Komsomol, was not just a submarine. It was a fusion of conflicting demands. The Naval Command wanted a high-speed, deep-diving attack platform. The scientists were battling to contain a nuclear reactor within a cylindrical steel shell. The core technical challenge lay with the VMA reactor. Unlike the relatively modest single-reactor system of the Nautilus, the Soviets opted for a twin-reactor arrangement. This decision was born partly out of a desire for redundancy and partly out of the initial difficulty in producing highly enriched uranium, HEU, necessary for a smaller, more powerful single core. The VMA reactors were larger, requiring significantly more complex plumbing and heavier shielding than the American counterparts. Chief designer Vladimir Peregidov and his team were forced to innovate rapidly, often without the necessary prior testing and validation. The major concern that plagued the Soviet engineers was radiation safety and the acoustic signature. They knew the Americans focused heavily on quiet operation, but their own initial designs, driven by the urgency of power output, were inherently noisy. The complex steam piping, the heavy circulation pumps, and the gearbox of the single massive propeller radiated noise into the hull and, crucially, into the water, turning the K-3 into a potential sonar beacon. The construction process was fraught with risk. The workforce, though dedicated, lacked experience in nuclear-grade construction. Welders, used to conventional steel, struggled with the precision and documentation required for reactor-grade piping. In a legendary, yet terrifying incident during the installation of the primary cooling circuit, workers used standard pipe jointing material contaminated with graphite, a material highly corrosive when exposed to high-pressure, superheated water. This necessitated a massive, hurried, and extremely hazardous teardown and replacement of entire sections of the reactor loop, further delaying the schedule and exposing workers to risk. The Soviet answer to the Nautilus's strategic potential was initially centered not on stealth, but on brute force and speed. The Project 627 design was highly hydrodynamic, allowing for a blistering submerged speed, eventually reaching over 30 knots, faster than the initial Nautilus, and a massive armament of 8 forward torpedo tubes. Furthermore, Peregidov's team incorporated a radical, though ultimately problematic, feature, a specialized, large-caliber T-15 torpedo designed to carry a massive nuclear warhead intended for retaliatory strikes against coastal targets. The focus was on a swift, high-impact first strike, a direct reflection of the Soviet priority for strategic shock value over the subtle, sustained hunter-killer role being pioneered by the U.S. When the K-3 was finally commissioned in 1958, the Soviet Union could boast that they too had a nuclear submarine. The propaganda value was immense. Khrushchev hailed it as the triumph of Soviet engineering. However, the reality within the naval staff was different. The K-3 was an operational nightmare compared to the Nautilus. Its reactor plants were notoriously temperamental. Its crew suffered from chronic ventilation and heat problems, and its noise profile made it a liability in a genuine submerged hunt. Soviet engineers, peering at the detailed, albeit secondhand, reports of the Nautilus's months-long deployments, were most aghast not by the speed, but by the sheer, silent endurance. They had built a sprint boat. The Americans had built a marathon runner. And in the game of underwater hide-and-seek, the marathon always wins. The realization hammered home. Building a nuclear submarine was one thing. Building a reliable, quiet, and crew-sustainable nuclear submarine was an entirely different and far more difficult Cold War technology. The maiden operational patrols of the Soviet Project 627, starting with the K-3 Leninsky Komsomol, quickly exposed the critical gap between design specifications and wartime readiness. Submerged endurance, the Nautilus's greatest strength, became the K-3's crippling weakness. It wasn't the fuel that was the limit, but the machinery and the men. Life aboard the early Soviet nuclear submarines was a brutal, continuous battle against the environment they were supposed to control. The reactors generated immense heat, and the cooling systems struggled to cope, resulting in engine room temperatures that routinely exceeded 40 degrees Celsius, often forcing engineers to work in little more than their underwear, battling heat exhaustion. More critically, the haste in construction and the inadequate shielding resulted in measurable radiation leaks in various compartments, an ongoing, insidious threat to the crew's health and morale that necessitated shorter patrol cycles. But the most immediate and strategically critical flaw was the acoustic signature. The American submarines were designed with silence as a primary weapon. The Soviet boats were an afterthought of noise. The twin VMA reactors required powerful, noisy primary coolant pumps. The massive reduction gearbox for the single propeller was not properly isolated from the pressure hull. When the K-3 attempted to operate at high speed, its purported advantage, it became a blaring acoustic beacon, easily detectable by the growing network of American fixed underwater hydrophone arrays, the SOSUS sound surveillance system. During simulated tracking exercises in the Barents Sea, Soviet anti-submarine warfare, ASW, surface vessels reported being able to track the K-3 three from distances of 40 to 50 kilometers at patrol speeds. This was a catastrophic realization for Admiral Gorshkov's command. A nuclear submarine that could be tracked from that range was not a silent hunter. It was a glorified, extremely expensive target. The crews, particularly the sonar operators, nicknamed the Project 627 boats the Roarers because of the deafening internal machinery noise that made it nearly impossible for them to effectively use their own passive sonar to detect other vessels. They were essentially blind and loud. In contrast, the detailed intelligence reports the Soviets managed to acquire on Nautilus and her successors, the Skipjack class, highlighted the American obsession with silence. The Skipjack class, which entered service shortly after Nautilus, adopted the albacore hull design, a teardrop shape that dramatically improved underwater hydrodynamics and reduced flow noise. Crucially, the U.S. Navy perfected the floating raft concept, mounting the entire reactor, turbines, and reduction gears on a massive, shock-mounted platform suspended within the hull, effectively isolating the machinery noise from the outer pressure vessel and the water. This technical finesse was what truly stunned the Soviet observers. It wasn't just the raw power of the nuclear core that allowed the Nautilus to remain submerged for months. It was the entire integrated system that managed the heat, contained radiation, and, most importantly, dampened the sound so the crew could maintain silent operations for the duration of the patrol. The Soviet engineers realized that they had rushed the fundamental steps of noise reduction, treating it as an operational luxury rather than a strategic necessity. The K-3 could theoretically stay submerged for months on its fuel, but the noise, the heat, the radiation, and the sheer operational fatigue rendered long-duration, effective patrols impossible. The American Nautilus was a functional warship. The K-3 was, for a period, a dangerously ambitious, high-speed engineering experiment. The pressure to silence the fleet began to consume the Soviet naval construction budget, leading to the rapid, desperate development of subsequent, quieter classes. The starkest measure of the Soviet technological deficit, and the element that most shocked their deep-water strategists, was the difference in crew endurance and habitability. The ability of the Nautilus and her successors to stay submerged for months was not merely a feat of engineering. It was a revolution in naval logistics and crew psychology. On a diesel submarine, the necessity of snorting every day or two provided a natural, if often tense, break in the submerged routine. The surface run allowed fresh air to be cycled in, moisture to be vented, and the internal atmosphere to be renewed. On the Nautilus, this external dependency was gone. The internal atmosphere was managed by a complex array of chemical scrubbers, oxygen generators derived from the electrolysis of seawater, and sophisticated air conditioning systems designed to maintain a stable, livable environment for 100 or more men. The limiting factor was no longer fuel or air, but simply the availability of spare parts, fresh water, which was also generated on board, and critically, food. For the American nuclear submariner, life at sea transformed. The submarine became a self-contained, pressurized world. The lack of engine vibrations, the stable temperatures due to rigorous cooling, and a comparatively quiet environment, when operating at silent speed, meant that crews could sustain high levels of performance for extended periods. This longevity translated directly to strategic flexibility. The Nautilus could steam from the U.S. East Coast, transit the Greenland-Icelandic GUK gap, conduct intelligence gathering off the Kola Peninsula for weeks, and return without ever being detected by surface patrol or aircraft. The Soviet reality, as experienced by the crews of the early Project 627 boats, was dramatically different. Despite the fuel advantage, the operational constraints were crushing. The internal atmosphere control was rudimentary. The air scrubbers were often insufficient, leading to high levels of carbon dioxide buildup and a pervasive, acrid atmosphere. The heat from the poorly shielded machinery spaces bled into the habitable zones, leading to constant dehydration and fatigue. Crucially, the internal noise of the reactor pumps and reduction gears was a continuous, bone-vibrating roar, forcing constant use of ear protection and fundamentally disrupting sleep and concentration cycles. Admiral Gorshkov's staff received demoralizing internal reports detailing the decline in crew efficiency after only 30 days submerged. One report noted that the chronic vibration and noise led to a 25% increase in critical mechanical errors and significant deterioration in sonar performance due to operator exhaustion. The Nautilus could conduct an effective 60-day long-range patrol. The K-3 was often forced to abort missions after 45 days due to machinery failures, internal environmental decay, and crew exhaustion. The very definition of a submarine being limited by the men. The engineers and designers, including Peregudov, began to recognize that Rickover's genius lay not just in the nuclear physics, but in the human engineering. The American nuclear fleet had achieved a perfect symbiosis. The reactor gave the submarine infinite operational range, and the habitability systems gave the crew the capacity to utilize that range. The Soviets had the reactor, but they had not mastered the internal ecosystem necessary for sustained, deep-sea warfare. This vast endurance gap meant the U.S. enjoyed continuous strategic presence in the world's oceans, while the Soviet Union's first nuclear fleet was effectively constrained to shorter, more predictable patrol routes close to home waters, a limitation that further fed the Kremlin's sense of deep vulnerability and technical inferiority. Even as the Soviet Navy strained to bring the noisy, complicated Project 627 fleet into operational readiness, the United States was already leaping into the next generation. The USS Nautilus had proved the viability of nuclear power. The USS Skipjack, SSN 585, launched in 1959, proved its true strategic potential. The Skipjack class represented the first complete marriage of nuclear propulsion and advanced hydrodynamics, making the Nautilus obsolete almost as quickly as the Nautilus had obsolete the diesel fleet. The key to the Skipjack's revolutionary performance was its hull. Abandoning the conventional wartime-tested hull form of the Nautilus, which still retained elements designed for efficient surface travel, the Skipjack adopted the pure, symmetrical, teardrop shape pioneered by the experimental diesel submarine USS Albacore, HSS 569. This shape was optimized for one environment only, underwater speed and maneuverability. The result was a submarine that could effectively fly through the water, exhibiting a level of high-speed performance previously confined to imagination. The Skipjack possessed a single, massive reactor plant and, crucially, only a single propeller, simplifying the drivetrain and reducing internal complexity. This design allowed the submarine to achieve submerged speeds of well over 30 knots, a true hydrodynamic speed that left even the fastest Soviet surface destroyers struggling to keep pace, let alone the early, heavy K-3. When operating at its silent, patrol speed, the Skipjack was a ghost. At flank speed, it was an unstoppable underwater missile. Furthermore, the Skipjack class perfected the noise reduction techniques pioneered on the Nautilus. The implementation of the floating raft, where all major noise-generating components were mounted on a massive platform isolated by specialized shock absorbers, was standardized. Engineers treated the vessel less like a ship and more like a carefully insulated acoustic laboratory. This relentless focus meant that the Skipjack, despite being faster and more powerful than the Nautilus, was also significantly quieter. It achieved a level of acoustic superiority that would define the strategic balance of the Cold War for the next 2 decades. In Moscow, intelligence analysts were forced to concede a chilling realization. The United States was not simply ahead, it was now widening the technological gulf with every new class. The Nautilus was a shock. The Skipjack was a strategic nightmare. The Soviet Project 627 boats were built to chase and counter the Nautilus. Now, they were expected to hunt a submarine that was significantly faster, quieter, and more maneuverable. This disparity was forcing a fundamental, expensive, and dangerous reevaluation of the entire Soviet shipbuilding and naval doctrine. Admiral Gorshkov immediately tasked his engineering and design bureaus to initiate Project 671, Victor class, the first attempt to truly emulate the skipjack's speed and acoustic stealth. But the reality was that the Soviet Union lacked the specialized industrial base, the precision tooling, the high-quality acoustic materials, and the microengineering culture that Rickover had mandated in the U.S. Navy. To achieve the required silence, the Soviets would have to spend years and billions attempting to solve the complex acoustic puzzle, essentially running a parallel, desperate race to catch up to a standard of quality that the Americans were already perfecting at sea. The success of the skipjack confirmed that the Cold War in the depths was not merely a numbers game, but a brutal, winner-take-all competition for technical sophistication and acoustic supremacy. Faced with the undeniable success of the skipjack's pure hydrodynamic form and the crushing acoustic deficit of their own Project 627, the Soviet leadership initiated a series of crash programs. The realization had sunk in. If they couldn't be as quiet as the Americans, they had to be faster, deeper, or capable of striking first. The priority shifted to maximum performance within the constraints of their existing technological capacity. This led to the development of several parallel, highly ambitious, and often competing design bureaus. The initial response was the refinement of the Project 627 into the Project 658 Hotel class, the Soviet Union's first attempt at a nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine, SSBN. While the SSBN concept was a direct response to the American George Washington class, the engineering challenges were compounded. They had to take the already noisy and temperamental Project 627 platform, stretch it, and add 3 massive R-13 short-range ballistic missiles in the sail, a modification that further degraded the boat's hydrodynamic performance and increased its complexity. The result was a loud, top-heavy strategic platform, a testament to the priority of achieving strategic deterrence at any cost, even at the expense of operational secrecy. Meanwhile, the naval designers, led by the talented but perpetually resource-starved engineers, focused on raw speed. This drive eventually culminated in the radical design of Project 661 Papa class, later embodied by the singular submarine K-162, later K-222. This boat was a masterpiece of Soviet metallurgical innovation, utilizing a strong, light titanium alloy hull instead of conventional high-tensile steel. This radical decision allowed the Papa class to dive deeper and, critically, achieve unprecedented submerged speeds. The K-162 was not built for stealth. It was designed for raw, hydrodynamic escape. Its purpose was to utilize its speed to sprint out from the cover of its home waters, launch its cruise missiles, and then escape before NATO ASW forces could close the distance. On December 18, 1970, the K-162 conducted its legendary speed trial, achieving a staggering, sustained 44.7 knots submerged, earning the NATO nickname Plavnik, Finn, and the Western designation Papa class. This remains the world record for the fastest submarine ever built. While this speed was an engineering triumph and a significant propaganda coup, Soviet engineers knew its strategic limitation. The K-162 was deafeningly loud. The twin 40,000 horsepower high-speed reactors and titanium reduction gears created a massive cavitation noise at the propeller. It was essentially a giant, high-speed acoustic target. Its titanium hull also presented enormous challenges in welding, repair, and long-term maintenance, making it a prohibitively expensive and complicated experiment. The American strategy, rooted in Rickover's original vision for the Nautilus, was one of passive superiority, achieving mission kill by remaining undetected. The Soviet response, as embodied by the fast, loud K-162, was one of active risk, attempting to overcome detection through sheer speed and aggressive offense. Soviet intelligence reports detailing the sustained, silent patrols of the Thresher and Permit classes, the successors to the skipjack, which could sit silently on the edge of the Barents Sea for weeks, often drove home the realization that the U.S. had chosen the superior, more survivable path. The Soviet pursuit of hydrodynamic superiority was a necessity born of failure to achieve acoustic superiority, a costly strategic detour in the silent Cold War of the depths. The American ability to deploy the Nautilus and its quieter successor for months at a time was amplified by a secret, pervasive technological marvel that formed an effective acoustic barrier around the Atlantic and Pacific, the SOSUS sound surveillance system. This system, originally conceived in the early 1950s, became the indispensable weapon for tracking the noisy, ambitious Soviet nuclear fleet. SOSUS consisted of vast arrays of sensitive hydrophones, laid on the ocean floor, often at the edge of the continental shelf, and linked by thousands of miles of submarine cables back to highly classified naval facilities ashore, known as NAVFACS. The most critical of these arrays spanned the JUK, Greenland, Iceland, UK, gap, the primary bottleneck through which Soviet naval forces from the Northern Fleet had to pass to reach the open Atlantic. The system was designed to exploit the characteristics of sound propagation in the ocean, particularly the Deep Sound Channel, DSC, or SOFAR, sound fixing and ranging channel, a layer of water where sound travels thousands of kilometers with minimal loss. The enormous power and, critically, the noise generated by the early Soviet nuclear submarines, the roarers of Project 627 and the fast hotels and echoes, made them ideal targets for SOSUS. Their heavy, high-speed machinery radiated low-frequency broadband noise that could be picked up by the passive arrays at ranges exceeding hundreds of miles. For the Soviet Naval Command, the existence and efficacy of SOSUS were an ongoing, strategic nightmare. It meant that every time a Project 627 submarine left its base at Murmansk or Polyarny, it was likely being cataloged and tracked by the Americans even before it cleared the Barents Sea. The long-endurance patrols of the Nautilus and Skipjack were not just exercises in endurance. They were often dedicated to listening in the same waters, building up a comprehensive acoustic library of the Soviet fleet's unique signatures, the telltale thumps, whines, and clanks of their specific pump systems, turbine frequencies, and propeller cavitation rates. This acoustic transparency severely compromised the Soviet Union's strategic deterrence. Their ballistic missile submarines, SSBNs, were tasked with hiding in the vastness of the ocean to ensure a retaliatory second strike. But if their position was compromised upon departure, they became pre-located targets for American attack submarines, SSNs. The 20-knot, months-long, silent capability of the American boats meant they could be quickly vectored to the last known position of a Soviet SSBN detected by SOSUS and conduct a sustained hunt. Soviet engineers and scientists, once they fully grasped the operational reality of SOSUS, were forced to dedicate enormous resources to reducing their own radiated noise. This effort became known as the Quiet Revolution within the Soviet Navy, a massive, decades-long project involving remounting all machinery on rubber-insulated foundations, slowing down propeller RPMs, redesigning pump impellers, and most drastically, attempting to reverse-engineer Western technologies for noise-dampening coatings and precision engineering. The fact that the Nautilus could perform its mission in spite of its early noise levels was only possible because there was no Soviet equivalent to SOSUS in place to counter it. The enduring legacy of the Nautilus was not just its own performance, but the strategic systems it galvanized, which in turn locked the Soviets into a relentless, decade-long game of acoustic catch-up. The true, terrifying potential unlocked by the Nautilus's endurance was fully realized with the introduction of the Submarine-Launched Ballistic Missile, SLBM. The ability to stay submerged for months on end meant that a missile platform could not only hide, but also sustain a continuous, mobile threat, creating a virtually invulnerable second strike capability. In 1960, the United States launched the USS George Washington, SSBN 598, the world's first operational ballistic missile submarine. It was, essentially, a stretched skipjack-class hull, inserting a new 130-foot missile compartment containing 16 Polaris A-1 SLBMs. This fusion of nuclear propulsion and strategic nuclear weaponry was the final, devastating strategic consequence of the Nautilus's technological breakthrough. The George Washington immediately altered the global strategic balance. Land-based missiles, ICBMs, and bomber fleets were vulnerable to a preemptive strike. Satellites could photograph their locations. But an SSBN, operating silently in the deep ocean, was immune to surveillance and practically impossible to track and target simultaneously. This guaranteed the U.S. the ability to retaliate even after absorbing a massive Soviet first strike. The ultimate Cold War insurance policy, known as mutually assured destruction, MAD. For the Soviet Union, this development was even more alarming than the Nautilus itself. The American SSBNs, utilizing their extended endurance, could position themselves off the coast of Western Europe or even transit the Arctic, placing Moscow and other key industrial centers within range. The Soviet diesel-electric SSBNs, such as the initial Project 629 Golf class, had a surface or partially surface to launch their short-range R-11 FM missiles, making them slow, vulnerable, and strategically limited. The frantic Soviet response was the Project 658 Hotel class, their first nuclear SSBN. Equipped with 3 vertically mounted R-13 missiles in the sail, the Hotels were loud, hydrodynamically inefficient, and suffered from many of the same reactor issues as the Project 627 attack boats. Crucially, the R-13 missile had a short range of only 600 kilometers. This meant the Hotel had to steam deep into the Western Atlantic or even closer to U.S. coastlines to put targets in range. This necessity of operating far from home waters and close to the American acoustic tripwire, SOSUS, dramatically increased their vulnerability. Soviet engineers and naval strategists recognized the core problem. The American SSBNs were silent, reliable, and could remain on station for 60 to 70 days with long-range missiles. The Soviet counterparts were loud, unreliable, and had short-range missiles, forcing them into highly dangerous patrol areas. This disparity in operational efficiency derived entirely from the Nautilus's initial endurance and reliability, meant the Soviet Union was always playing catch-up. They were forced into a cycle of rapid, often technologically risky, development. The subsequent Soviet SSBNs, such as the Project 667A Yankee class, were designed to overcome these issues by placing 16 missiles in the hull and improving noise reduction. But even the Yankee class, deployed in the late 1960s, was often acoustically compared to the much older American George Washington, illustrating the persistent decade-long lag in the foundational technology of silent, sustained nuclear operation, a lag that cost the Soviets their early strategic advantage in the underwater arms race. The ability to hide the bomb for months, proven by the Nautilus, became the ultimate currency of Cold War deterrence. The gap in hardware performance between the Nautilus-era American nuclear fleet and its Soviet counterparts was vast, but equally critical was the disparity in personnel selection, training, and professional culture. The technological leap required by nuclear propulsion demanded not just better engineers, but a wholly different kind of sailor, a challenge the Soviets struggled to overcome due to entrenched political and military structures. In the U.S. Navy, Admiral Rickover established a nuclear power program built on absolute technical merit and relentless qualification. The officers and enlisted personnel were subjected to rigorous, multi-year training focusing on reactor theory, thermodynamics, and extreme procedural adherence. Every sailor, regardless of their rate, e.g., sonar man, electrician's mate, machinist's mate, understood the complexity of a nuclear power plant and the necessity of maintaining meticulous standards. This philosophy, that every valve, every switch, every procedure mattered, ensured the exceptional safety record and, crucially, the unparalleled reliability of the American fleet, allowing for those sustained, months-long submerged patrols. Rickover's personal interviews, which were legendary for their intensity and focus on moral character as much as technical skill, ensured a core of nuclear submariners who viewed their duty with an almost religious sense of responsibility. The Nautilus and skipjack crews were trained to manage complex systems under extreme isolation. They were engineers first, seamen second. This focus was what made the difference between a submarine that could run for 2 months and one that had to return due to a minor, preventable engineering casualty. The Soviet Navy, constrained by the political oversight of the Communist Party and historical traditions, struggled to replicate this culture. While Soviet engineers were brilliant and dedicated, the operational crews often lacked the depth of specialized, standardized training. Promotion and command structure often prioritized party loyalty and political reliability over pure technical mastery, leading to a system where reactor operations were sometimes managed by personnel lacking the deep understanding of physics and redundant safety systems that define the American program. This difference manifested in operational readiness. The early Soviet nuclear boats suffered from numerous reactor incidents, including partial meltdowns and steam leaks, precisely because of inadequate training and procedural shortcuts necessitated by the intense pressure to meet operational schedules. While the Nautilus completed its missions flawlessly, Soviet vessels like the K-19, a Project 658 Hotel-class SSBN, suffered a catastrophic reactor accident in 1961 due to a cooling leak caused by a faulty weld and poor onboard maintenance, an event that became known as the Widowmaker. The necessity of long, submerged patrols also demanded superior life support systems. The U.S. Navy invested heavily in atmospheric controls, sanitation, and even better food quality for morale. The Soviet engineers, focusing their limited budget and industrial capacity on raw power and hull speed, often neglected these human factors. The persistent problems with heat, noise, and radiation on early Soviet boats were symptoms of a culture that viewed the reactor as a military weapon, rather than a precision engineering system requiring continuous, delicate management. The result was that the Soviet crews endured immense hardship and risk, fundamentally limiting the operational duration that the nuclear fuel should have provided. The American lead wasn't just in the reactor core. It was in the human core that managed it, allowing the Nautilus to truly leverage its infinite endurance. The strategic consequences of the Nautilus's long endurance and the subsequent arrival of the quieter skipjack class forced both superpowers to drastically escalate the art and science of anti-submarine warfare, ASW. The underwater realm was no longer just a transit zone. It had become the primary, silent battlefield of the Cold War. For the American Navy, the early lead in quiet nuclear propulsion allowed them to dictate the terms of the ASW contest. Their nuclear attack submarines, SSNs, leveraging their quietness and months-long patrol capabilities, became the ultimate ASW weapon. Their primary mission shifted from simply hunting enemy convoys to tracking and sanitizing the Soviet ballistic missile submarines, SSBNs. This was the infamous Silent Hunt. American SSNs, like the Thresher and Permit classes successors to the Skipjack, would deploy for 60 to 90 days, often performing barrier patrols along key choke points, or more daringly, conducting trail missions, silently following Soviet SSBNs from the moment they left their northern fleet bases. The Nautilus's legacy of endurance made this possible. The SSN could wait patiently, submerged for days or weeks, allowing the noisier Soviet boats to pass before picking up the trail and remaining in contact for thousands of miles. The Soviets' roarers were effectively providing a continuous acoustic signature, an invitation to be followed. The Soviet Navy, meanwhile, had to scramble to develop a credible counter-ASW capability. Their surface fleets were relatively effective against diesel submarines, but the high speed and deep diving capacity of the American SSNs, combined with their acoustic stealth, rendered conventional surface hunting tactics obsolete. Frustration grew as Soviet ASW destroyers repeatedly lost contact with American boats that could simply go deep and go fast, leaving the sonar operators listening only to their own propeller noise. The Soviet response was threefold. Mass production. They compensated for lack of quality with quantity, rapidly building a large fleet of surface ASW ships and helicopters, attempting to overwhelm the ocean with sensors, particularly in choke points like the Norwegian Sea. Specialized attack submarines. They redoubled their efforts to quiet the later generation of attack boats, Project 671 Victor class, and developed the ambitious, deep-diving Project 705 Alpha class, a titanium-hulled boat that could potentially outrun and outmaneuver any American SSN, prioritizing speed and depth over acoustic stealth. ASW Intelligence and Doctrine. They focused on learning the patrol habits and operating characteristics of the U.S. fleet, relying heavily on espionage and oceanographic research to predict where the American boats would be, since they couldn't reliably detect them. The most shocking realization for Soviet observers was the sheer ubiquity of the American nuclear presence. Because of the Nautilus's initial proof of concept, the U.S. was able to maintain multiple SSNs on station across the globe at any given time. One off Murmansk, one in the Mediterranean, another shadowing a Soviet task force. This continuous, months-long, silent presence provided the U.S. Navy with an unparalleled intelligence advantage and a constant threat projection capability, solidifying the nuclear submarine as the most strategically vital weapon system of the mid-Cold War era. The legacy of the Nautilus was thus the institutionalization of the submerged, invisible threat. The persistent, years-long acoustic gap became intolerable for the Soviet Union. Unable to replicate the specialized manufacturing and engineering culture of the U.S. Navy's nuclear program through indigenous means, the Kremlin turned to its most trusted and ruthless resource: espionage. The technological details of how the American SSNs achieved their stunning acoustic stealth, specifically the floating raft mounting system and the precise metallurgy of the propeller and pump components, became the Soviet Navy's highest priority intelligence target. The Soviet intelligence services, the KGB and the GRU, launched an intensive, global effort known unofficially as the Silent Theft. Their goal was to acquire the blueprints, the specialized material specifications, and the production tolerances that allowed the American submarines to stay submerged and silent for months. The most damaging and consequential success of this espionage effort centered around the acquisition of highly sensitive Western technology, particularly from Japan. The most notorious example involved the Toshiba Kongsberg scandal in the mid-1980s, though its roots lay in the earlier realization of the Soviet acoustic disadvantage. The key component sought was a sophisticated, multi-axis numerical control milling machine, a device capable of manufacturing a propeller with extremely precise, non-repeating blade geometry. A conventional or improperly milled propeller generates cavitation noise, a loud, distinct acoustic signature caused by the formation and collapse of water vapor bubbles at the blade tips, which is easily picked up by sonar. The American submarines had invested heavily in skewed propellers with ultra-smooth, complex surfaces that dramatically reduced this cavitation noise. The Soviet engineers, constrained by simpler, less accurate machine tooling, could only produce propellers that were inherently noisier, effectively canceling out their efforts on hull quieting. The successful, albeit illegal, acquisition of these Toshiba Kongsberg machines allowed Soviet shipyards, specifically at Severodvinsk, to finally begin producing propellers for their later generation submarines, like the Project 971 Akula class, that approached the acoustic quality of their American counterparts. This was the moment Soviet observers felt they had finally, through a dramatic act of industrial espionage, closed the operational endurance and acoustic gap that had plagued them since the launch of the Nautilus. For the American intelligence community, the discovery of this transfer was a colossal strategic defeat, directly compromising the hard-won acoustic advantage pioneered by Rickover's program. It meant that the once loud Soviet fleet was becoming capable of silent, long-duration patrols, the defining capability of a Nautilus. In a broader sense, this reliance on espionage underscored the fundamental truth of the Cold War submarine race. The technological advantage of the Nautilus was so immense that the Soviet Union could not rely solely on its own scientists and engineers to catch up in the necessary time frame. The ability of a single submarine to remain operational, submerged, and silent for a quarter of a year fundamentally altered strategic doctrine, and the efforts to replicate that capability drove the world's most intense and dangerous technological theft of the Cold War. The relentless pressure to match the Nautilus's performance and subsequent endurance breakthroughs had a profound, often tragic, costs that extended far beyond military budgets and operational statistics. The human and environmental toll. In the American program, Admiral Rickover's insistence on safety and rigorous testing, while demanding, largely contained the risks to the crews. The Soviet rush, however, driven by political deadlines and technological desperation, resulted in a grim legacy of accidents and environmental contamination. The early Soviet reliance on less tested reactor designs and compromised construction standards led to a series of catastrophic events. The reactor accident aboard the K-19 in 1961, a direct consequence of inadequate cooling and faulty construction, resulted in the heroic deaths of numerous crew members exposed to lethal radiation doses while manually repairing the cooling system. This incident, and others like it on the early Project 627 and 658 boats, underscored the profound difference in the management of nuclear risk. For the American Navy, the Nautilus's reliability was the norm. For the Soviet Navy, danger was often an accepted part of the early nuclear operational routine. The environmental impact was equally devastating, stemming largely from the Soviet need to rapidly dispose of spent nuclear fuel and decommissioned reactors. The sheer volume of nuclear power plants being rushed into service, coupled with the difficulty of maintaining safe storage facilities in remote, frigid regions, led to a doctrine of expediency. The Barents and Kara Seas, adjacent to the Northern Fleet's main operating areas, became clandestine dumping grounds. Between the late 1960s and the collapse of the Soviet Union, large numbers of failed or damaged reactor compartments, highly radioactive spent fuel assemblies, and even entire decommissioned submarines, like several of the Project 627 boats, were intentionally scuttled or dumped in the shallow waters of the Arctic shelf. This practice was the unseen, poisonous consequence of the Cold War submarine race. The American design philosophy focused on long-term operation, safety, and eventual proper defueling, was a costly but necessary ethical standard that the Soviets, in their frantic race, often ignored. Soviet engineers and shipbuilders, while technically achieving parity in later classes through espionage and sheer persistence, often operated in an environment where safety protocols were secondary to political mandates. The internal reports on crew health, documenting elevated radiation exposure and chronic illness, were highly classified but paint a picture of a human cost far exceeding the American experience. The ultimate tragedy of the Soviet effort to match the Nautilus's endurance was that the rush to put a reactor in a hole led to the compromise of everything else: crew safety, operational longevity, and environmental responsibility. The Soviet engineers, initially astounded by the fact that the Nautilus could stay underwater for months, were eventually forced to confront the harsh reality that true, sustainable nuclear endurance requires not just fissionable material, but an entire industrial culture committed to precision, safety, and the long-term stewardship of a volatile power source. The invisible, silent pollution of the Arctic waters remains a testament to the price paid for that technological catch-up. The launch of the USS Nautilus in 1955 was more than just a naval event. It was the starting pistol for the ultimate Cold War technology race, a silent, subterranean struggle where the prize was global strategic dominance. The sheer capacity of the American submarine to remain submerged for months, a fact that stunned Soviet engineers, didn't just revolutionize propulsion, it redefined the very concept of naval power projection and warfare doctrine. The enduring legacy of the Nautilus is not its speed, which was quickly surpassed, nor its silence, which was improved upon, but the demonstration of infinite operational persistence. This capability fundamentally rendered the world's oceans transparent to the West, while forcing the Soviet Union into a costly, decades-long game of catch-up. First, the Nautilus created the strategic depth advantage. By proving a submarine could operate submerged for months, it legitimized the submarine-launched ballistic missile, SLBM system. The American SSBNs, utilizing this persistence, became the most survivable leg of the nuclear triad, ensuring the capability for a second strike and stabilizing the terrifying concept of mutually assured destruction, MAD. The Soviet response was immediate but inherently flawed. Their early nuclear SSBNs were louder and less reliable, always leaving the Soviet deterrent force vulnerable and perpetually on the defensive. Second, the Nautilus established the acoustic standard. Soviet engineers, initially focused on raw power and speed, as seen in the Loud Project 627 and the Fast Papa classes, were eventually forced to concede that nuclear power without acoustic stealth was strategically worthless. The American nuclear program, driven by Rickover's fanatical adherence to quality control and silence, forced the Soviets to spend immense resources trying to replicate the engineering precision of the floating raft and complex propeller geometry, a gap so wide it eventually required massive industrial espionage to partially bridge. The difference between the Nautilus's functional quietness and the K-3's roar determined which superpower owned the silent depths. Third, the Nautilus pioneered the concept of the global undersea presence. The months-long patrols meant that American attack submarines could continuously monitor Soviet fleet movements, conduct intelligence gathering, like tapping into undersea cables, and patrol the very doorsteps of Soviet bases without fear of running out of fuel or oxygen. This ubiquity provided the U.S. Navy with a massive, sustained intelligence and tactical advantage that no surface fleet could ever match. Ultimately, the disbelief among Soviet engineers over the Nautilus's endurance was not just technological, it was strategic. They understood that they were facing an enemy that could simply vanish for a quarter of the year, carrying the threat of nuclear annihilation or conducting continuous surveillance, only to reappear months later, thousands of miles away. The Nautilus transformed the Cold War from a battle waged on the surface and in the air into a perpetual, silent chess match fought in the crushing blackness of the deep ocean, a battle the U.S. won by having the first, and for many years the only, truly self-sufficient weapon of infinite endurance. The quiet hum of that first reactor at Groton did not just power a ship. It powered a new age of unseen global conflict.